So today we're tackling a massive cognitive dissonance that honestly completely derails how most of us approach self-improvement. We're going to explore the absolute mathematical reality behind habit formation. Specifically, why getting just a tiny bit better every single day feels like a literal waste of time in the moment, but is actually the most explosive strategy for growth you could possibly use.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this number right here, it changes everything. If you improve by just 1% every day for a year, you don't just get 37% better. No way. You become 37 times better. That is a massive distinction, and it's the whole core of how small habits unlock this crazy, explosive 37x growth.
Let's actually look at the exact mathematical calculation behind this compounding effect. It's simply 1.01 raised to the power of 365. Now, day to day, a 1% change sounds like a totally meaningless rounding error, right? It barely feels worth mentioning when you're just doing, one tiny extra push-up or awkwardly plucking a single chord on the guitar. But that vast gap between how ridiculously small it feels today and how absolutely massive it becomes over a year, well, that's exactly why we constantly underestimate tiny habits.
Now, what's really interesting here is the actual shape of that growth over time. If you look closely at that middle column for day 180, you'll see that for the first several months, compounding growth looks almost perfectly flat. It is basically indistinguishable from doing absolutely nothing at all. The real mathematical explosion doesn't happen until the very end of the year.
That brings us to the absolute most dangerous phase of the entire process, the flat part of the curve. During these middle months, the visible evidence of all your hard work looks exactly like failure. You're putting in the sweat, but you're seeing zero immediate payoff. This single mismatch between when the effort happens and when the results actually become visible is the precise reason almost everyone abandons their consistent small habits right before they would have paid off.
But what if we flip the equation? What happens if you get just 1% worse? This is where the math gets a little bit uncomfortable, because the reality of this rule cuts both ways, and we really have to talk about the darker half of this mathematical reality.
It's called reverse compounding. The exact same math just runs in reverse. A 1% decline every day doesn't just casually erase a tiny bit of your progress, it actively compounds downward. Think about those everyday moments. A slightly later bedtime, a slightly skipped workout, a slightly avoided task at work. In the moment, these single instances genuinely feel incredibly small and perfectly harmless. But the danger isn't any individual day. It's the compounding direction that these small days are pointed in. Sustained over months, these tiny negative habits gather incredible downward momentum. The tricky part is that neither the improvement nor the decline announces itself loudly, which is exactly why both are so easily ignored. And this brilliantly illustrates a pattern I am sure we've all lived through personally at some point. On the left, we've got the overhaul. The extreme effort, the total diet reset starting on Monday, the punishing Red Bull-fueled 5-hour study binge. It spikes really high, and then it inevitably crashes right back to zero. On the right, we have the 1% habit. Boring consistency. It turns out that dramatic, all-at-once life resets usually lose to boring consistency over any meaningful timeline. So why does the overhaul always fail? Well, it really comes down to your willpower reserve. Dramatic effort is so hard to sustain specifically because it draws heavily on your limited daily mental capacity. And let's be honest, we've all been there. A total life overhaul completely drains the tank in a matter of days. But the tiny 1% habit, that demands almost none of that reserve. Because it's so nearly effortless, it survives long enough to actually reach that magical part of the curve where the compounding becomes visible. Now, at this point, a fair bit of skepticism usually kicks in. You might be asking yourself, okay, does this actually work for everything? Is steady, boring compounding literally the only way to achieve success in life? Well, let's address that directly.
To be perfectly honest with you, no. Not every goal compounds smoothly at a steady 1%. Some skills and goals genuinely do require occasional bigger, intense pushes. An intense study sprint right before a final exam, a super demanding project deadline at work, or pushing your body to train for a specific athletic event. Sometimes you just have to work incredibly hard in short bursts.
However, the big difference between success and total burnout lies in your daily baseline. What you do on the ordinary, unremarkable days between those big pushes is what matters most. That baseline completely determines whether your intense bursts of effort are building on top of a rock-solid foundation or if you're just exhausting yourself by starting from absolute zero every single time. Let's move to our next section, how to actually apply this math. According to the sources, there are 3 practical rules required to actually survive the flat part of the compounding curve without giving up.
Step 1. Make it embarrassingly small. Step 2. Track the streak. And Step 3. Expect the flat stretch. Let's break down exactly how to execute these.
Step 1 is all about making the daily version of your habit embarrassingly small. And I mean really small. Not the ideal version of the habit, the smallest version. Instead of aiming to read one full chapter, aim for one single page. Instead of a whole 1-hour workout, aim for literally 5 minutes of stretching. It needs to be so remarkably tiny that it is genuinely impossible to skip, which completely removes your motivation as a limiting factor on your bad days.
So the crucial point is this: the goal isn't the output, it's surviving the flat part of the curve. If your initial habit is too large and requires too much willpower, you are absolutely going to run out of gas long before the compounding math can step in to save you. Step 2, track the streak, not the outcome. Because we know the tangible results of your new habit are going to remain completely invisible for months, you desperately need something else to look at for encouragement. The daily record of consistency, the sheer physical act of marking a big red X on a calendar, that has to become the only evidence you rely on to stay motivated during the quiet phase.
And Step 3, expect the flat stretch and consciously treat it as confirmation rather than failure. Knowing in advance that the growth curve is going to look completely flat before it finally bends upward is often the single biggest factor in whether someone actually keeps going. When you see 0 physical results on day 30, that doesn't mean the system is broken. It means the math is working, exactly as expected.
Take a second right now and think about a new habit you're trying to build. Does it feel too small to matter? You know, it's incredibly common to look at your tiny 5-minute effort and feel this creeping fear that you just aren't doing enough to actually move the needle in your life.
If it feels too small to matter, that means you are doing it correctly. According to the actual math, the habits that are demanding enough to feel immediately impactful are almost always the exact same ones that burn you out before any compounding can actually happen. And this brings us to a profoundly powerful realization. The visible results were never the evidence that your habit was working. The showing up was always the evidence. The results simply take longer to catch up to the action. Never let the natural delay in the visible payoff trick you into abandoning the math.
So, I really want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on today. What is the absolute smallest version of a habit you could start today and still genuinely call a real win? Find that embarrassingly tiny action, protect your willpower, stick with it through the flat curve, and let that 37x compounding math do the heavy lifting for you. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time as we continue unpacking the ideas that shape our world.